Welcome to Around the Empire, a fully independent podcast. Lend your support at rockfin.com/aroundtheempire, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. And I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Our guest today is Dr. Neda Bolourchi. We talk about the recent election in Iran, a deep dive about the background, people involved, the consolidation of power, and the outlook for the future. And in a bonus segment, we talk about the U.S. shifting priorities toward great power competition and what this means for the policy and strategy with respect to Iran. Dr. Neda Bolourchi is an assistant professor and the Associate Director of Middle Eastern Studies at Rutgers University-New Brunswick Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Her research travels include years in Iran, Syria, and Armenia. She has peer-reviewed work on religion, politics, legal systems, and the modern Middle East. And she also has a JD in international law, and her legal work includes international and comparative analysis of human rights violations in the Middle East. We recorded this on July 2nd, 2021. Neda Bolourchi is here speaking to us from New Jersey. Hello, Neda. Thanks so much for coming back on the show. It's great to talk with you again.
Thank you for having me, Joanne. It's great to be back.
So there's a lot to talk about for an expert on Iran and the region today. And I reached out to you because, with respect to the Iranian election, like in Western media, we generally hear the repetition of the same narrative. A hardliner won the election. A lot of candidates were disqualified. Voter turnout was very low. Which is a bad indicator. But as you've mentioned in our previous talks and other interviews, like Americans are offered a very oversimplified view of Iran via our media and even our leaders and commentators. So I wanted to talk to you to hear your thoughts on it. So maybe you could give us a little bit of background on the parties involved, the political process, and so on.
Absolutely. So this time, I do have to say that American media may be getting it right.
Yeah.
Coming into this election, and this was not this election that just transpired in Iran on June 18th, was not a surprise. I should start by saying that there were major indicators of what would transpire in terms of low voter turnout and a swing to the conservative side, at least a year, maybe even a year and a half into it. And so largely stemming from the Trump sanctions policy, the maximum pressure sanction policy. And so Iran has been largely decimated by what has been called economic warfare that was put upon it by the Trump administration, and that was compounded by COVID. And I should tell you, I was in Iran 2 years ago now. So when I was in Iran, and I think it's helpful to sort of see how things change, is that people were like, oh my God, Trump is so crazy. I mean, of course, I'm oversimplifying here, but on this I'm not, but Trump is so crazy. What is he doing? And then Rouhani kind of basically sucks, that he's impotent and isn't doing anything to help. And these are sort of the oversimplified sentiments of, people I ran across from Shiraz to Isfahan to Tehran, across sort of the political spectrum. And this largely maintained itself over the course of the last 2 years, but increasingly in the last 6 months, that part of 6 to 8 months, the front part of, oh, Trump is crazy, kind of got dropped. And it basically was Rouhani is horrible, who is the current president, who has just been, he can't stand for re-election. His term of 2 terms is up. And so part of that has to do with the Iranian media and the outlets, in that so much of the media that is even not technically state held is also held by conservatives or allies of conservatives. And so a lot of the media attention went from this dual aspect of Trump and Rouhani to just Rouhani. And throughout sort of the very short campaign season that happens in Iran, and to be very clear, unlike the United States that has this really protracted, long campaign, I don't know, years, in Iran, it's very limited to a couple of weeks. And there's a very short time period for candidates to register. There's a very short time period for candidates to be approved, and I'll talk about in a minute. And then there's a very short, it's a couple of weeks, 3-4 weeks, during which the candidates can publicly run and engage in debates. And so during what we'll just generally call the campaign season, the media, as well as the debates and candidates, all focused on Rouhani and anyone with what we generally will call reformists or even pragmatists as having signed on to the JCPOA or not having done anything about the elections. And so about the economy. And so just to sort of remind everybody that James Carville's adage during the Clinton years, it's the economy stupid, applies, I don't want to say fully universally, but it's applicable everywhere, was very clear in Iran. Again, in the sense that talking hundreds of billions of dollars withheld from Iran, its foreign reserves were definitely, not only held, but superseded its economic growth, which was null. Inflation was at 40%. Its unemployment was just a little under that. And then all of this is compounded by COVID. So this election in Iran was largely an indictment of Rouhani, the current president, and then anyone in his administration or an ally or any affiliate, really. And so last year there was, and so to the point of there was this great idea that everybody knew or should have known what would transpire this year. There were elections last year where there was a significant move to the right, and the right in Iran is a bit different than it is here, but that's neither too important. And so that was a clear indicator that this would transpire.
Right.
And then you get to what is surprising for the Iranian elections is, as I mentioned, you have candidates who go, they register, and then this group called the Guardian Council basically vets them. And this is what has been largely reported on by the media. And so the Guardian Council, and they do this, it's historically, this is part of their sort of job description, is they vet those candidates. And so, and how they vet them sort of varies from election to election. And that is the reason that, or one of the reasons that people have sort of problems or find the Iranian election system problematic, is that there is this group that sits on top of it and eliminates candidates. So who did they eliminate this year? Well, former Iranian President Ahmadinejad, which was not surprising. He has been disqualified before, so it was no surprise he would be disqualified again. His sort of antics and his what we call his antics during his own presidency, sort of his and really his conflict and competition with Iran's leader Khamenei, and what was sort of ultimately considered disrespect in that struggle between them is the reason he will always be disqualified from here on out. Another person who was disqualified is one of Rouhani's vice presidents, which a number of people did not think the Guardian Council would actually do, because in theory, you need a reason, right? And so last name is Jahangiri. So Jahangiri's brother was alleged to have engaged in corruption. Again, that shouldn't reflect on Jahangiri, and we don't know exactly what, if any, technical reason there was for eliminating him, because the Guardian Council has subsequently said they don't have to give a reason.
Really?
Anyway, so yes, and this becomes particularly, I'm gonna say, egregious with the next person. The third person, the person who got the most attention for being eliminated is Ali Larijani. And he comes from this very highly regarded, highly connected, conservative / pragmatic or pragmatist family, the Larijani family. His brother, and so he is sort of like the deal maker. There are two other brothers, particularly Sadegh Larijani, who sits on the Assembly of Experts, which is a different council, which part of their job process is to elect the leaders and select the leaders. His brother is discussed amongst those who are being considered for the next leader position. Although, a great number of people would disagree with that. So they are part of this very powerful, they are the part of the establishment. And so Ali Larijani gets disqualified, and nobody can really believe it, because despite the fact that they are this elite, powerful family, the Larijanis don't really have a popular base, right? And they're not charismatic. These are your centers. They're kind of like former President Rafsanjani of Iran. They're your deal makers. They're your backroom guys.
Are they well connected with, Khamenei and the military establishment, or are they more on the business side?
They're in all of that. Because their family they were business in Iran, it sort of everything kind of overlaps. And so you have the religious connection and you have the business connection, and that gives you the inroads into your politics. And that's really sort of seen through the brothers, right? So you have the politician, you have the businessman, you have the cleric. And that is really the Larijani family. And so they are, when I say that they are part of the establishment, they helped build the establishment. They are your traditional conservative but pragmatist family, in the sense that you will call them conservatives, but they will cut a deal. And so, and importantly, Ali Larijani helped with the JCPOA. And so this is the big, not only did he help sort of bring about the JCPOA, he specifically aided the Rouhani administration with the JCPOA. And so when I say that they're deal makers, this is an example, because Rouhani is not a reformist, right? He's not a liberal. He is not any of those. He is center, right? He too is a pragmatist. So this deal, the JCPOA, is seen very much as, well, we don't really, the Iranians are kind of like, well, we don't want nuclearization for weaponization purposes, and we'll go along to get along because we need sanctions relief. And these are the guys who are part of that group who are just like, let's do a deal. So Ali Larijani, who doesn't have a popular base to get elected from, he's not going to get millions of votes. Anyway, so the Guardian Council eliminates him in what everyone considers really an unnecessary move, except to demonstrate their power. And I say that in the sense of there are members of the Guardian Council, and increasingly the political elite, who are becoming more radical conservatives. And those radical conservatives or ideological conservatives do not like these pragmatist conservatives like the Larijanis. And so I believe that the elimination of Ali Larijani is about the fact that they're saying there's a new moment happening in Iran where we are not going to be cutting deals. We are not letting in or allowing power to people like the Larajanis, and you're out. Also, if you had let Ali Larajani on a candidate stage, he may have reminded everybody that it wasn't Rouhani's fault the JCPOA didn't deliver economic benefits or that sanctions were. So there are the very short-term realities of what Ali Larajani could have said as a candidate. And then there are sort of the coming transitional shifts inside of Iranian politics, domestic politics, that wanted to deliver, I think, some messages to him and his brothers. So this is sort of the backdrop of all these eliminations.
Yeah, and now I understand one opinion that I read. I believe it was the guy you just mentioned, who I'm afraid I'll mispronounce his name, but they also suggested that it may have been a face-saving measure for the guy. Like if he had been approved as a candidate, and as you said, he doesn't have a popular base, you know, he would have bombed in the election, or he may have bombed in the election, and that someone may have been trying to not ruin his reputation to sort of save him for later. You didn't mention that as a possibility, but now I understand why someone might make that analysis. But you know, that would almost be, well, why wouldn't the guy just step down himself? But anyway, it is complicated. Now, when they say reformist, there were real reformist candidates who tried to get in the running, right?
Well, in the sense, like, if you want to consider like Jahangiri, you did, right? There were two reformists, and again, but not sort of your Iranian reformists tend to be, I think, a little bit more charismatic, a little bit more in touch with people. And so your sort of top reformists and your reformists, like, that Americans would know more, is somebody like Khatami, who was president 97 to 2004, 2005, right? Somebody who talks about dialogue and transformation and civilization, and
like cultural changes and
cultural changes. Somebody, I mean, even Iran's, actually the other one who everyone talked about possibly running was Iran's foreign minister Zarif, who, yes. So if I will tell you, for years now, I once years ago, long before I met him, saw Zarif in a banquet room. And I don't really think too many people were paying, you know, within American sort of politics and analysis and media, paying too much attention to him. But Zarif was like a rock star. Zarif loves people, and he's very charismatic. And he actually came down off the dais and walked through, and people just like came up and started shaking his hand. And he was very, very much a politician's politician. He's very savvy. He very much likes it. And people, when things are going well, right, respond to him in a great way. And he is, I think, one of your quintessential reformists, in the sense that, you know, he, if allowed, he would probably be akin to sort of a social democrat of sorts. And we can sort of talk about how that wouldn't fit for other sort of national security and security paradigms. But within Iran, he is far over in terms of what he would like to do. And that relates to sort of the Khatami people, the Zarif people, and these are sort of your really most visible reformists. So you do
gets along. He you know, he makes his way around in the West very, very well. I guess he was educated here, and I read an article called "The Who's Who of Iranian Players Behind the New President" on the Quincy Responsible
Mhm,
Statecraft website by Mohammed Sahimi,
mhm.
and you know, he explains sort of what we'll get to later on is sort of the consummate insiders who are taking power, control of everything now. So, like, are they afraid of Zarif? You know what I mean? Why do you think that, or is he too young? Like, why do you think he?
No, he's not too young at all. Well, because for the reasons I just described. So Zarif, in the sense that as the primary face, despite the fact that the JCPOA started under Ahmadinejad, the negotiations, Zarif and Rouhani are the two that are most visibly tied to the JCPOA, which means that they are tied to Iran's economic sort of revival or its destruction, right? And so, and this, it isn't just that, but it's also the demographics. Iranian demographics do not favor conservatives. There is no way, based on sort of, I won't even say free elections, but less encumbered elections,
Yeah.
that conservatives win, right? The demographics aren't there. I know this, we know this, the Iranians know this themselves, right? So there is no world in which a reformist should lose, except for something like this, where the economy has been tanked from the outside or from the inside. And so there has to be, right, some sort of machination. So even despite the fact, and I will, people can disagree, but I think even despite the fact that the Iranian economy has been in free fall, and Zarif and the other person that we were going to talk about as kind of a reformist is the banker Hemmati, who is in charge of the central bank. So they have done what they can on one side to manage expectations, right? So for when you're inside of Iran, everything is, you really, the currency and sort of the what is happening with the economy sometimes is and actually it applies anywhere, is a reflection of expectation, right? And can you manage the psychology of a population? And so that they don't cause these huge swings. It's kind of like the stock market. And so they have actually done a pretty decent job, actually a formidable job in trying to manage what they could with the economy by trying to manage expectations. And so the last thing that conservatives wanted was for Zarif to say, you know what, I'm going to run. And there has been a call for him to run. There were, as I said, more than 10 years ago, I was like, this guy could be a president if they let him. And I even think if they let him, that they would try to remove term limits for Zarif. He could be so popular and do a lot of things. And that is clearly bound by, if you see, there was this huge uproar because of these tapes that got released. Where Zarif was giving an interview, an oral history interview over like 7 hours for posterity's sake. And it is really unbelievable to me that somebody so savvy, so politically savvy, would in the middle of negotiations agree to do an interview, and such a long interview, and then proceed to say things like, well, the foreign ministry and diplomacy took a backseat to General Soleimani, and he always got what he wanted, but I couldn't ask things of him. So this really, and so the tapes get leaked in April, if I remember correctly, and it causes a huge uproar in Iran. It causes hesitation on the Iranian side of negotiations. It plays into the conservatives' hands, even though Zarif wasn't running. It causes discord between Khamenei and Zarif, and Khamenei and sort of the reformists, even though they're all really agreed in terms of like national security, right? Iranian national security, Iranian defense. It's more a disagreement about how to achieve things. And so this tape, and these tapes, I should say, were, I think, precisely timed, and they may serve to, not that Zarif said that he would run in the future, and he made it very clear in December that he wasn't going to run, but I think there was clearly a fear that he could get talked into it or that he would change his mind. And these tapes do multiple things, right, for the against the JCPOA, to help with the elections that just happened, and they also work against Zarif's future political career. So it is really the timing, not just of their release, but that he actually did the interview when he did it, is pretty astounding for somebody who has historically been so astute.
So savvy. Like, why would he take that risk?
Yeah.
But
so that has happened. So yes.
So
that is, the reformists are basically done for the foreseeable future in Iran.
Yeah. And from what I read, tell me if it was wrong, the people who are in power now, and including, I just saw some headlines, I didn't read the details. Is it, am I pronouncing it right? Raisi? Is that the new president? So he used to be, I guess, their head of their Supreme Court, right? Their top justice. And I guess they just appointed someone to replace him who's extremely hardline and in league with this group of people who are now in power. And they were talking about like a really tight-knit group. You have, the Ayatollah, you have his son. Who are this group? I think they may even be calling them a gang of four, which is an old term. Like, this seemed to be extremely calculated. Is that just Western media, or does that seem to be the case to you?
No. So no. So what you have to know about Khamenei as a leader is that, one, he's a great tactician, but he also is a fantastic strategist. And on top of this, he's a micromanager. So, and all of the, and then he has really at this point unrivaled power. So this is a person who has risen and rose very quickly within the Iranian, the revolutionary structure. And so he is a former president of Iran. He is one of the, I think technically he's the only one who has kind of come out of the Iranian presidency unscathed. Being the president of Iran is generally not a good thing.
You end up in ruins after your time.
Yeah, you end up in ruins in one way or another after the fact, except for him. So he has his sort of background is through the Islamic Revolution, the Islamization of the Iranian Revolution, the Iran-Iraq War. He survived a bombing on the Iranian parliament. He then, he becomes Iran's president. And then when the original leader Khomeini and his heir apparent Montazeri have a falling out over, a number of theological issues about how clerics should and whether they should sort of rule, as well as there were thousands of murders in 1988, and Montazeri came out and said this is not, this should not have happened, and it should not have happened. And so a year before he dies, Khomeini basically sort of agrees that to put Montazeri under house arrest, changes the constitution so that you don't have to be an Ayatollah to become the leader. Khomeini was not an Ayatollah. He was not even a grand Ayatollah. Montazeri, he was. So they changed the constitution and changed the requirements. And so when Khomeini dies, think about it, Khamenei comes out of this not only against Rafsanjani, but everybody else to become a leader. And then has he did have peers around him, right? Everybody who came through the revolution and the home seminary schools. And so he basically slowly starts rising above them to become, as the title sort of indicates, supreme leader, so that he really doesn't have people around him anymore who can, they advise, right? Nobody checks. And so that is where they're at. And so all of this is to sort of give you some background into when I say he's a tactician, he's a strategist, I really mean it. He
like
has,
against all the odds too.
Against all the odds, he has risen, has gotten and taken power, kept it, and he is, within all definitions, supreme. And so back to my point about the JCPOA, when these maximum pressure policies go into effect and Iran is in a spiral and then COVID happens, Khomeini doesn't, the Rouhani and Hemati and everybody tries to do what they can to make the damage less. But Khomeini takes this time and says, you know what? This is a very good time to plan out Iran's future. And we are going to make some fundamental shifts. And so part of this is that there has been this long sort of division between the reformists and the conservatives about how to balance and which way to go. The reformists tend to be Western educated, Western aligned. They like Western technology and Western companies. Their creativity and Western creativity kind of go together. They would like to merge platforms and do all sorts of things that they think that the West can offer because it is free and creative and it would work well with Iran's engineers and scientists and technicians and all of that.
And
the conservatives,
for people who don't know, the Iranian population is largely, highly educated, right?
Yes, phenomenally educated, to the point where I think there's an estimate of 100 billion a year in brain drain out of Iran because, and Iran does produce fantastic, of course, doctors, but engineers. I was just looking at somebody who just left his position at NASA as a propulsion engineer. There's a whole host of people, Caltech and Stanford. I'm not exactly sure how it happens, but Caltech and Stanford seem to get every hot Iranian scientist really as they're coming out or arriving in the United States. And so, yeah, it's really phenomenal.
Yeah, I went to school with a couple of people from Iran at Rutgers Engineering School back in the 80s. And that's a small sampling. And I don't think they were able to finish. I think with all the things going on, they had to leave, but like really smart, really nice people. So yeah, it's just kind of baffling.
Yes. So
the disconnect, between the culture and the, just how many, the kinds of connections that you describe that the reformists see the possibilities for. I see it too.
And so much, a lot of the reformists were educated in France, Germany, as you said, the United States. And there is, they, even within the humanities, they do have to study sort of the things that I taught at Columbia for its core, right? The sciences in terms of like Aristotle and the core of what is considered Western contemporary civilization and ancient civilization. So those, Iran has historically in the 20th century very much a Western focused education system that teaches all of those things, and their sciences are unbelievably strong. And so they meld very well together that way. So the reformists tend to lean, or at least want to balance what's happening in Iran with Western technology and Western sort of connections. Conservatives don't. right? Even though the Khomeini is known for saying neither east nor west, there has been a tendency amongst conservatives to want to go east. And I've seen this particularly, I keep tracing it back probably to at least 2004, where it was very minimal, but over the last 15 years has grown increasingly vast, to the point where, you know, the connections with Russia and China are so immense. And now, again, this idea with this election, with the transformation that Khamenei wants to make, not only are the reformists sort of done in Iran for the short to maybe medium term, but with that, Iran is going eastward. That the last 5 years have catalyzed the sort of eastward shift in Iran. The amount of Russian actions and Chinese activity is just, I think, probably at its height.
Yeah, I mean, some people say, well, you know, Russia and Iran, their alliance is not, you know, they're historical enemies and this and that. But as you watch the alliances form, they look pretty like there's a lot of synergy at the very least. And I think they're stronger than people would like to believe. Sorry,
so
I have a cat here who
no.
insists on becoming part of this podcast.
Is it all very cute?
Sorry.
So it is a bit transactional, right? But it is also long term. So, and it's becoming, and it has increasingly, I think I gave a talk in 2007 about this. The Iranians don't trust the Russians, right? And nobody is quibbling over that. And historically, there are disagreements and grievances, particularly from the Iranians, against the Russians. But that does not take away from what is now, I think, at least a 25-year sort of move towards each other, where there has been mutual benefits, and they trust each other more than they trust, let's say, France or Germany, and most certainly than the United States. They have worked to each other's benefit, in Syria in particular. So this idea that the historical grievances, you know, from the 19th century, and you know, the Qajar dynasty losing land to the Russians, okay, fine, great. Soviet meddling in the Cold War, okay, fine. But where are things now? And you know, if Iran asks, what have you done for me lately? Russia can sort of say, we've done these things. Similarly, Iran can say, and we have done these things. There is a synergy that, and they are mutually benefiting from that. So I would caution anyone from saying this is a short-term thing. Clearly it's not. We're beyond, we're in at least 2 decades now, where they have worked together in the Caucasus regions. They have worked together in Syria. We can talk about Turkey. So no.
Now, talk about the most confusing situation in the world, all relations with Turkey, right? That is one confusing country, but yeah, and then the relationship with China, and we'll talk about this a little more in the bonus question. The shift to, I mean, there seems to be a shift that's trying to happen, but sort of bogged down in other alliances. But anyway, I'm going to postpone that until our bonus question. I don't want to get us too far off track.
No worries. I was just going to circle back to, because you had asked about sort of this grouping together. So yeah, I had been talking about Khamenei, and so Raisi, and the new head of the judiciary, Ajay, these guys are basically, particularly Raisi. This is a yes man. I'm not the only person who says it.
Which
think
one,
everybody,
the new judge or Raisi?
the new Raisi is in particular a yes man. The new judge as well, Gholam Hossein Ejayi, is also a bit, maybe not as much as Raisi, but definitely another yes man. And so, Khamenei is 82 years old. And so again, as a tactician, a strategist, and a micromanager, he has taken sort of the crumbles that have been left of the Iranian economy to sort of say, okay, what can we do and how do we do it? And as an 82-year-old, he also has to understand he may not survive the next 8 years. And so, and even though he sounds fine, and everybody is always saying he's about to die, he doesn't sound like he's about to die. But again, right, micromanager, strategist, this is a key moment in time. So, and even though he publicly has said that the Guardian Council went too far and maybe they were unfair to some of the candidates, probably Larijani, because Khamenei himself appointed Larijani as the deal maker with China. I mean, this is the other part that's like sort of outrageous about the Larijani elimination, is that Supreme Leader's envoy to China, who sealed the China deal, has been eliminated from these elections. So, it's fine. You don't go to a second round. It makes the Raisi election clean, and he doesn't have to get out there and make sort of any second round, because the way it works in Iran is you have to have gotten 50% of the electoral vote that was cast in order to win. And so Raisi got what he got last time. Raisi ran against Rouhani in 2017, and I think he got about 16 million votes. And as I told you, the conservatives don't have the demographics, so his vote tally is basically the same. And so that doesn't change. And so you don't want somebody like that or any other conservative to have to go into a second round, particularly against a weak reformist or another conservative. And you don't want a second round because surprises can happen. It's an Iranian election. Iranian elections until this year have surprises. That's why people don't wager on them. That's why, people don't place bets or try and predict who will become the president, because they are phenomenally unpredictable, except for this one. So back to Khamenei, taking what was sort of handed to him, he says, well, I'm 82, let's plan this out. And so, and don't forget, there will have to be sort of this vote on a successor to him. And he may, everyone is saying, and I did sort of agree a bit as well, that this very much could be Raisi, and that the presidency is a great training ground for the next leader, right? Don't forget, Khamenei was also a president. And so can he handle it? How does he direct internal intelligence services, national services? How does he deal with the foreign ministry that has to be on the international stage? Do they get the JCPOA done? How does Raisi handle all these things? The other thing I think is that by having Raisi, it allows not only for him to sort of develop some skills, but if something were to happen to Khamenei during his presidency, I don't think Raisi will become the next leader. He will stay probably as president, and somebody else will come up, whether that is Khamenei's son. It probably will not be a Larijani at this point. That is what is transpiring. And so by putting conservatives and yes men into very important positions, the presidency, there have been lots of critics, and they're correct in the sense that because there's a supreme leader, the power of the president is very limited. Right. Correct. But the power of the president is about domestic politics in Iran. Right. It is an outward show for international relations, who goes to the foreign ministry. But the president also does a lot, as it is in the United States, does a lot in terms of domestic politics. So not only the economy, but again, works with and can be sort of this grating interference on intelligence apparatus and security agencies inside of Iran. And so the reformists have also been those people who said, more social freedom, don't, more like civil liberties, don't be so difficult on the populace. Like, they are, again, that part of the Iranian populace who wants more. And the conservatives generally are
putting
not.
that kind of pressure on it.
Right. So there are these tensions between the reformists and not just the reformists and the conservatives, but particularly the reformists and Khamenei. And so this is his moment where he gets rid of them. And so when you have a right, and it's a lot for an 82-year-old to deal with, right? Let's just think about it.
Yeah.
And that, he's a micromanager. So if you don't have to deal with this grating irritation about, let us do this, let us try that, let us do, then it makes your life easier. It makes the running of government smoother.
Mm.
And so you now have a consolidation of all arms of the Iranian government into the conservatives. So in theory, at least it's not as grating on those higher up, right? Particularly Khamenei. But in theory, it should also be smoother. And so, which there's a lot of bureaucracy in the Iranian government, and things happen and you never know why. But when you have a consolidation, it should, right? Things should work easier, smoother, faster, just generally more efficient. But that also means that you have less concerns about security, the internal security, border security, and then how Iran has this forward defense, right, in Lebanon and Syria. So there are no really concerns about that. And again, as a micromanager and a strategist and tactician, this means that Khamenei can sort of more oversee than have to interfere. And if he passes during these 8 years, it doesn't become an opportunity for interference or intervention into a selection process, right? And I think with these appointments to the judiciary, with Raisi at the presidency, the Iranian population, the domestic population who lives in Iran, will definitely be less likely to go out and riot and protest, because these guys all, everyone knows not only their reputation, but what they have done.
Yeah.
And so 2017, 2019 is significantly less likely to happen again.
That's interesting.
This is, so it is, yeah.
So they're sufficiently pacified, if you will, or basically in enough fear. They realize that any uprising will be cracked down on quickly and harshly, and yeah. So
Yes.
what about the son? He, from what I read, is a lot like the father, extremely powerful, very much has his hands in everything. Does he have the same skill as a micromanager and so on?
Well, yes, because I think you're talking about, so Khamenei has a couple of sons, but the one that's largely considered sort of a successor is Mujtaba. And so Mujtaba Khamenei sort of as the, I don't want to say the right hand of his father, but has definitely learned from, right, his father. And so these sort of characteristics and learned skills, you can definitely see in him. I think, I don't think that Khamenei is necessarily decided on a successor. We don't really know, but I think he has concerns about putting Mujtaba really forward as a successor, because then there's an inclination that, oh, things have become hereditary, right? As opposed to elected.
Which it has not been in the past, right?
Right. So it went from Khomeini to Khamenei. And so everyone is talking about how And because Khamenei has been in power for decades now, what happens in the succession? And there is constantly this talk about a council and a council replacing the supreme leader. I don't think that that's necessarily, I think people are a little confused about that. What happens is that there's a temporary 3-person council that helps in the transition process until a leader is sort of elected, right? And so Khamenei needs that 3-person transition council to be his people. So it will be the judiciary head, and it's laid out in the Constitution. And so one way to kind of, if he is inclined to try to get Mujtaba in this position, is to, one, get enough people on the Assembly of Experts who are yes men. 2, make sure that the people who go to the transition council are also his people, which because he appoints judiciary and he just helped with the presidential election. So these are all different ways, sort of machinations that can help. And, again, I don't think he's decided, but these are sort of, as it were, sort of loopholes as to how this can happen. And I do think that there are a number of years left for him to decide, but again, if you have the sort of the structure in place, then you can move a lot easier.
Yeah. That makes a lot more sense. I appreciate that detail. I feel like we could talk about it for another hour, but I really need to move on to our bonus question and try to wrap up.
Because I'm going to have to go,
Yeah. So for the bonus question, I want to go to some big picture, and for me, what is a very confusing situation. So from your opinion and your analysis, what do you think the main goals of the new Biden administration are now that there's certainly a lot of pressure and it seems like some actual movement shifting things toward great power competition, and that's becoming the top priority, rather than the smaller, if you will, battles being bogged down in the Middle East, you could say, and these ally entanglements that seem to keep us there. But now Iran's, as we mentioned before, their alliance with the 2 big great power targets are Russia and China, and they are, closely intertwined with them now. So, and that alliance seems to be growing every year, and as you mentioned, is probably a long term. Now, some analysts have also said that the Iran-China deal is a major game changer. So how do you see this playing out? What do you think that this administration is trying to do, and how will Iran fit into that? The answer to the bonus question is in the extra bonus segment for patrons. You can get access to all bonus content by subscribing at Rockfin or Patreon, plus other perks like patron live streams, Zoom calls, and access to our Discord channel where we can talk among ourselves. So that's my pitch, and I hope that some of you will join us. And now I'll continue with the interview wrap-up. All right. Well, thank you very much. So I'll come back into the public part of the interview. If you would, tell people how to follow your work, and if there's anything that you'd like us to look at that I should link in the show notes, and all of that.
Okay, will do. I don't have a website. I still don't have a website, hopefully, maybe finally this year. But I am on LinkedIn, and I have forthcoming publications on the Iran-Iraq War, as well as sensory experiences and reading newspapers in Iran. So that's where you can find
That's
me.
really valuable stuff. Yeah, I'll get links from you and all that. And again, I really appreciate it and look forward to talking to you again. Thanks so much, Neda.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Neda Bolourchi. Find her at LinkedIn and find her work on her Rutgers University Center for Middle Eastern Studies webpage. This podcast is independent media, so listener support's really important. rockfin.com/aroundtheempire, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. The website is aroundtheempire.com. Find us on all podcast apps on Rockfin, Patreon, YouTube, and we're expanding to even more platforms. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, follow on Twitter @aroundtheempire, and we'll see you next time. Hang in there, everybody. Keep your head on straight. Take good care.